event. I'm Martin Sanchez-Jankowski, and I'm the director of the Center for Ethnographic Research. And we instituted a number of programs like this in the past, and we called it Views from the Field. And the reason that we did that was to give people a sense of, those of us who are doing field work, a sense of sharing with people in the community not only what we were learning, but to have some visions of what we were seeing in terms of those communities. And it was such a success in the past that we have repeated it over the years and have found that people have enjoyed it a great deal, because it does give you a sense of what our field, in terms of not only intellectually, but really physically looks like. And today it's my great honor to introduce a friend and a colleague for many years in the sociology department, who has been concerned for most of her professional life with issues having to do with culture in various aspects of societies, and has in recent times turned her attention to those kinds of issues that have been focused on in Africa, particularly sub-Saharan Africa. And she has done work in areas of Malawi particularly, although I believe initially she had gone to Botswana, and she has subsequently continued to do work in Malawi. And what she's going to focus in on, what she's focused in on in her research, is a lot having to do with HIV and how it actually has affected Malawi society, and maybe more extendedly various African societies. And what she's going to share to us today is the types of communities that she's interacted with while she has pursued this research of both doing observations on the one hand and conducting interviews on the other. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce you to Professor Ann Swidler of the Sociology Department.
Martin, did you press the right button here?
It's
all going. Okay. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I just wanted you to know that I take the word ethnography here with way more than a grain of salt. That is, it's partly a joke, not a serious claim that anything I'm doing is ethnography. But what I would like to claim is that I get, or we, there's a we involved in this process, whom I'm going to describe in just a minute, you can get an enormous amount of insight from the kind of research situation that I've been fortunate to be in for the last more than 10 years. So I want to first say that I thought coming over here, I thought, wow, what is the question to which all this insight and evidence and so forth is the answer? This is always the thing we ask our graduate students. You've gone out and found all this stuff, but what was the question to which this is the answer? And so I want you to know that there actually was an initial question, and that question has continued to shape the kind of things I noticed in the kind of haphazard process I'm going to describe here. And that question really was about how institutions work and what culturally both constrains and structures the way they can work. I had written about this and thought about this with respect to American culture and American institutions. And when I went to Africa, I went specifically with the goal of trying to understand why some, I didn't know what the unit should be, regions, communities, tribes, something or other, had different kinds of institutional capacities to respond to the AIDS epidemic. I did not actually end up finding a way to start answering that question. I actually, at the end, if you want, you can ask me. I've got a new research idea that might sort of lead in that direction. But I found another really dramatic way to think about culture and institutions, because it turned out, of course, that what I was seeing when I got there, and I'm going to show you some slides in a minute, wasn't the way African communities on their own were responding to the AIDS epidemic. That wasn't what was happening at all. What I was finding was how were internationally motivated and funded organizations trying to implant themselves so as to transform African societies. And it turned out that situation actually allowed you to see how certain institutional logics that were being brought in from the outside with kind of attached cultural expectations and a whole set of institutional logics on the ground, interacted with each other, sometimes forming really new systems or structures, or I don't quite know what to call them, and sometimes clashing in what turned out to be somewhat humorous ways. So all right, now I'll start with my slides, and part of this is just to give you, so I'm not supposed to step over the, what? Okay, I'm not supposed to step over there, but Malawi is that tiny little beige-looking strip that goes right into Mozambique. So if you see on the right, there's Mozambique, and that long, thin thing is Malawi between Mozambique and Zambia, with Tanzania a little to the north and Zimbabwe a little to the south, and South Africa as a relevant, it doesn't touch South Africa, but people dream about going to South Africa when they live in Malawi. Okay. And Malawi has about 16 million people. So although it is geographically tiny, it is very densely settled. And for an African country, that is actually, Botswana has something like 1.7 million people. So Namibia about the same. So for an African country, it's kind of middle-sized, not tiny, even though it looks geographically tiny. All right, this is just to give you a sense. This is actually more or less what, not all of Malawi, but rural Malawi, village Malawi looks like. This is the market near the first big motel I stayed in. That's a guy passing on the street, and that's a woman with her granary basically behind her. Okay, now my collaborator and the person who allowed me to go to Malawi, certainly in the way that I did, is Susan Watkins, and she's the woman on the left. We are there, and this is not irrelevant to the story I'm going to tell, with a woman who was many years earlier an interviewer on one of her projects, with whom Susan has kept in touch over many, many years. That woman married this guy, who it turns out we have interviewed, and he is, I've forgotten what his exact job at this moment is, but let's say he has been the head of the information section of the National AIDS Commission in Malawi. So if you want to understand how AIDS messaging gets decided for Malawi and how it actually gets done, he actually knows a huge amount, and then it turns out he knows a bunch of other things. So he's quite a fun guy. And these people come back again and again and again. Hundreds and hundreds of people have worked for her projects, and they all consider her something like a grandmother. They call her Gogo, which is the local word. All right, and the project at the time I joined it was called, the horrible title, MDICP, the Malawi Diffusion and Ideational Change Project. Can you imagine? I thought she was trying to not get the Golden Fleece Award and wanted to completely obscure what she was working on. And they got tons of NIH money, and now it's called the Malawi, oh my goodness, you can find it, the Malawi Family, no, the Malawi, I've forgotten what it's called. But anyway, it has a current name and it's still ongoing in certain respects. All right, they did a big survey in 3 regions, something like 4,000 people, longitudinal survey, so they re-surveyed the same people every 2 or 3 years, starting in 1998. They did surveys in 1998, 2001, 2004. They added biomarkers, so they actually knew who was HIV positive, who had STDs, who was, they know a lot of things about people biologically. 2006, 2008, and 2010, and I believe in 2004, they added a young cohort again so that they wouldn't have just an aging cohort. So this is really a huge project. It always had tons of graduate students, supervisors, interviewers, just enormous numbers of people. And one of the interesting features of it is that it was was entirely rural. So Malawi is a very rural country. Some 85% of the people are basically rural subsistence farmers. But it does have 2, and you could argue 3, medium-sized cities. And they were not doing research in cities, they were doing research in these rural areas. And what Susan did, and I really have tremendous respect for this, is that she did not go to one of the national research institutes. This created a huge amount of problems for her, by the way, but if you go to Tanzania or here or there, that's what you'll end up doing. You'll go to a research institute, they already have their interviewers, the interviewers are college educated, they may have no relationship to local culture at all. What she did was go into local villages not villages, she went to market centers, to trading centers in local areas, put a little sign up, just a single sheet of paper in English, saying we're recruiting interviewers, we need people with at least a Form 4 diploma, so high school educated, who know English and whose native tongue is whatever the local language is. If you're interested, show up here on Tuesday, which usually was the day after tomorrow, and we'll, bring your school certificate and we'll interview you and so forth. And so in every place they worked, they ran this kind of open call for interviewers who spoke the local languages. And remember, these had to be people who didn't currently have jobs. So they were high school educated, but currently looking for work. And people regarded this as a tremendous opportunity. And it meant that we had just enormous access to huge numbers of people. Now, this is just one scene of people lining up to do these interviews. So hundreds of people would show up clutching their little folders of whatever certificates and school exams and so forth in every single place. So this was replicated, remember, every 2 years and again from those people, sometimes the most intelligent or impressive or serious or whatever, desperate, I don't know, people would get more integrated into the project, so they would manage to either be hired back year after year or to, in one way or another, stick, or now you would think they would move up and become supervisors, but in fact, the preoccupation with credentials is so great that you could not have a person with only a high school education supervise someone with only a high school education. So the supervisors, who they also tried to recruit from people who knew the local languages, always had to be university educated, and this occasionally created real problems, which I could tell you about. But anyway, that's what it looked like. All right, now then, the motels. When I gave this talk, or a version of it, 6 years ago or something, and of course at that time, I only had a few years. Now I've been going for, I think, I started in 2004, but I skipped a year. So I think it's exactly 10 years, something like that. And I absolutely love it and intend to keep going as long as Susan stays alive, certainly, and maybe even longer, maybe as long as I stay alive. Claude keeps saying, but I thought your book is done. We just finished our book. We're going to get a comic. Wonderful, wonderful. I think it's going to come out soon, actually, because it's a fairly polished book called, the current working title is The Romance of AIDS Altruism in Africa. That will probably not be the final title, but close. It'll be that concept. So this is more or less every motel we stayed in, not quite every, but it's more or less. And some of them we went back to multiple times. So the Mpaweni Motel at the Mangochi turnoff, my absolute favorite. I love being there, and every time I can be there, I want to be there. And the Kaesa Inn, I spent the most time at, and then these others, less time. And you'll see also, there was some upscaling last year because we were trying to finish our book. All right. This is the Golden Peacock. I stayed one night and never again, I guarantee you. It's actually in the capital, not in a rural area. I had come in, the first year I went was 2004. I had come into town to interview someone. It turned out to be just a horrendously filthy, disgusting, horribly run. I can't say enough bad things about it. It was really nauseating and scary. The mosquito netting had big holes in it. The windows couldn't close. And lo and behold, I'm there trying to get to sleep in this just miserable situation. If you want, later I could discuss. I'll just mention the fact that the owner, whose ethnicity I won't discuss, but he was not a Malawian. That's not a Malawian African. As the cleaning woman came out with her little girl, they stopped and curtsied to this guy. Yeah. And then he said, well, just Malawian help is useless. They don't work, they don't do anything. And I thought, oh my God, I'd been staying at this wonderfully run hotel, run by this Malawian woman who's patrol. Anyway, it's a terrible experience. It's 11 o'clock at night. I'm trying to get some sleep, and I hear these people on the front porch drinking beer and just talking in incredibly loud voices, and they're Americans, not only Americans, but they have these strong country southern accents. And they're out there just talking away, and I go out in my nightgown, and I say, "Excuse me, could you keep it down? I'm trying to sleep." Who are they? It turns out they are an Arkansas church group who come to Malawi to dig boreholes, to dig wells, and they have a machine they bought or brought with them or something, some gigantic machine for digging these deep wells, these boreholes, that are vitally important. This is one of the most critical needs in Malawi. They're going around from village to village, putting in these wells, and not only that, but they say, well, you can't just leave them because, if you just leave them there and a lot of water collects around the wells, and then they get mosquitoes, and then they get malaria really bad, you got to go back and make sure the drainage is good, there's some engineering involved, and so on and so forth. So I realized this is just the first of hundreds and hundreds of encounters with altruists. Most of them just as well-meaning as these guys, but not nearly as effective. So first, what opened my eyes is, oh my God, Malawi is awash in usually Zungu, white people, who are trying to do good. So, all right. Then the first summer, we were in the Luwande Park Motel, and I've got to go here. This shows you, this is Jenny Trinitapoli, the young white woman, and she is now newly hired, associate or full professor at Chicago. So the MDICP has produced a lot of really good research and a lot of very, very successful young academics as well. And so now I'm going to show you a few pictures of this is me talking to the assistant manager at the motel, and this is another employee of the motel at the back. This is my friend, and for today's purposes, I'm going to call her Chifundo. And she is this just remarkably intelligent, capable. She's the woman that made me truly despise the guy at the Golden Peacock. Okay, and this is the motel she ran on behalf of a quite selfish manager. There's Susan Watkins at the same event. So, that's me holding her baby later. Okay, let me go back. Now, that first summer, we filled the motel. So what became central to Susan's and my thinking later, which is the amazing number of trainings that NGOs run in their attempts to stem the tide of the AIDS epidemic or prevent HIV transmission, didn't become as evident that summer. But what I started to really understand were several things about the local society. And one was the absolute centrality of patron-client ties. And I would say for anyone who's worked in Africa, you will rapidly understand. This had become clear to me even when I visited Botswana. I've done some research there. I've been there a couple of times. First of all, everyone you meet will tell you, just by the by, about whom they are taking care of. So that it's really, a middle-class guy who lives in the capital who showed me around was describing how every month he goes to the village where his grandmother lives. He fills the trunk with, a 5-liter thing of oil and a big container of sugar and a big thing of tea. These are the things she can't grow herself, and so he has to supply those things. And if she bought them locally, she would buy them in tiny little containers. They'd be very, very expensive. He can buy them in bulk and supply them, and so he goes there. And then it turns out, what was his business career? Well, his business career depended on the fact that at the place he worked, he had a very good job. He's actually an accountant. A guy wealthier and more important than he befriended him. And the guy not only gave him career advice and sort of encouraged him and to some degree helped him get a certified accountant degree rather than just a regular accounting degree, but he was, he himself had a house and he had a gardener. So he had somebody who gardened for him. So his wealthier friend came by and said, your garden looks so nice. Can you get your gardener to come and help me? So he said, certainly, and that guy befriended him, happy to do the guy a favor. This turned into an active business in which the wealthy friend would recommend his gardener to his wealthy friends, and my friend would get basically the payment And then he would give a small payment to his gardener. So he, in essence, got a whole subsidy to his income via his friend. And such economic arrangements are just, you start to understand that you really can't, the whole society doesn't work without enormously important patron-client ties. So almost everyone is helping people, at a minimum their younger siblings and the children of their own brothers and sisters. So that, you finish school, you have to help pay the school fees of your younger siblings, your brother dies of AIDS or of anything else, and his children are your responsibility. Very often to marry someone is to become responsible for her parents and so forth. So these chains of reciprocal interdependence, or Susan and I have called them unequal interdependence, we gradually understood that they were incredibly important, and we understood them partly as we ourselves became emotionally committed to the two women who ran that motel. So they were the first people I really met, and by the time I'd been there for a month, they didn't ask me for money, it was nothing like that. I became so emotionally committed to them that I have continued to help them. So they didn't ask, but I have continued to help them, to care about their welfare, to talk to them, to give them advice, to give them help. And that's because they recruited me into their world. That's what happens. That's what would happen to you. And so here I'm just going to say this dinner, this was on the lawn of the little courtyard of the motel on the last night we were there. And it was meant to thank us for having stayed in the motel. And every employee of the motel, including those who had the most halting English imaginable, who when you ordered something at breakfast, breakfast comes with the room, and their question, sausage, no sausage, do you want a tomato, and so forth. They never understood what you said, and they would stand there going like this, and then they would run away, bring the wrong thing, and then they would have spent 24 hours processing it, and the next day you would get whatever you had ordered the day before, because they would finally have worked out in their minds what you had said. They were all forced to give one of us a gift. So there was a gift-giving ceremony. The woman who ran the motel had gone out and bought all this tourist junk, wrapped it carefully in newspaper. Everyone was assigned a person to whom to give a gift, and that ritual was incredibly important to her. She arranged the seating. You did not have a choice about where to sit, and so the whole set of Zungu, not all of whom, by the way, were white. I mean, there's a Kenyan guy and so on, but the whole foreigners, the whole group of foreigners were scattered among the motel staff. So that was central to her vision of what this event had to be like. And it started, I have photographed this somewhere, but I couldn't find it. It started with dancing. So we all got up, and dancing there is not any, it's like you two could do it. It's kind of some combination of, 50s, kind of you shuffle your feet a little bit, and then you can't wiggle as well, but anyway, you don't look as good doing it, but you can kind of do it. And Susan, who was the head honcho of the project, and who even at that time must have been 75 or something, had to dance with the gardener, who was hilarious and quite a good dancer and had 3 teeth left in his mouth, and he was really, hurling his body around. So this kind of a ritual that was establishing reciprocity, interdependence, a sense of emotional connection was really important to how she did things. Okay, and then I have their stigma. So I want to say something. There's a huge interest in the AIDS business in combating stigma, and this was imported from the American understanding of HIV and AIDS, that the huge barrier to fighting the epidemic was stigma, and you had to get rid of stigma and discrimination. So this was imported back, unchanged, largely unchanged, into the African setting. Well, so turns out that really there's nothing recognizable as stigma there. It's not that people aren't upset to find out they're HIV positive. Of course, they're very upset. And when we first went there, there were no drugs, so people were dying in huge numbers. I guess I should say the prevalence was about 14% when we were there, and the lifetime likelihood of acquiring HIV was much higher than that. That is, the 14% represents only the people who are currently alive, not all the ones who've already died, and certainly not all the ones who will become HIV positive. So it was really one of the 7 most affected countries in Africa. But we're sitting at the table just chatting with the nurses. So the nurses and some of the supervisors stayed in the motel with us, and the nurse is saying, "Oh yes, my aunt has HIV, and she just behaved so badly. I mean, she had a lover, and she would take her daughter with her when she went to the lover, and this was just..." And so it was not like she wouldn't talk about it. I mean, I wasn't her best friend. She wasn't confiding in me. There were 6 or 8 people at the table, and I don't remember how the topic came up, but we started to realize, wow, this is just, an ordinary topic of conversation. Now, all right, now I'm going to move on because I don't have time to that's Simon Morfitt in the back, one of the Berkeley PhD students who's finished, and that is my friend Chifundo's baby boy. So, and this is a village, so just so you can see, there are villages. Okay. Then we also stayed during that year and several later years at the Kaisa Inn. And I'm going to say a few things about the Kaisa Inn. It was a much fancier looking place because the owner, and I'm going to use her real name here, Mrs. Anderson, a very impressive, extremely striking woman. I'm assuming when she was young she had been very, very beautiful. When we knew her she was already 60, and so you would have said instead striking. I'll show you a picture of her. Had married a Danish man. So she had been working as a nurse, I think not in Malawi, but in Zimbabwe or somewhere. She had met him, she had married him, and with his help, she had built this motel. And then he died of cancer. So she was there basically ruling this motel. And so I'll give you a little sense. There's Mrs. Anderson. This is in her living room. And this is a room at the Kaisa, and you can kind of see that it has a little bit of that Danish modern feel. So they probably had the furniture made for them. I mean, you wouldn't find that in a store. Nobody would think of buying furniture in a store. So, but they had it made, and they used local fabrics to create a modern, kind of slightly IKEA-like feel. And that's my little night lamp and whatever there. And then here's the cooking arrangement. They have an entire kitchen. We've seen this. I don't know why this is true, actually. They have an entire kitchen. It uses electricity. Maybe the electricity is too unreliable, but they actually cook out in back of the kitchen over wood and sometimes charcoal. And the cooks are, by the way, both male and female. It's not a completely gendered activity. And this is inside the Kaisa, so there's the dining room. That's Alex Weinreb, the white guy again, and some of the supervisors. And he now is tenured at Texas. Yeah, and really brilliant. And let's see, this is what the outside of the Kaisa looks like. Very, very nice. Then I have to go back. This is Chief Zulu. I'll give you all the pictures. So this is the local chief. He's a high-level chief, so he's not a village head man. He's not even a group village head man. He is a TA, traditional authority, which is sort of the peak official position in this little chiefly. There are also some paramount chiefs, but they're not directly in the hierarchy. So he's a very important guy, Chief Zulu. And this is inside Chief Zulu's house. We were taken with great ceremony to see him. And this is me standing with Chief Zulu. He's right next to me. That's his wife next to him. And the other 4 guys are his quote-unquote counselors. Okay, so now I want to go back and talk about a few points about the Kaisa. The first is, okay, Mrs. Anderson is an extremely impressive woman. We learned very quickly that almost nothing she said was true. As I used to say to Susan, she's a liar. And Susan said, no, she's a fabulist. And so she would tell you whatever sounded good to her. So it wasn't that she was lying about something like, you said you paid me, but you haven't. We occasionally ran across that in restaurants in the city. But no, it wasn't like that. She didn't cheat us out of anything. She would say, for example, you see that woman, we've all been meeting with her. Her husband has been beating her. And you see the other women, and yes, the other women would be cheering and clapping as the woman walked away. And that's because we've all been giving her support, because she's a battered wife, and it's very, very important. And then later you would talk to that woman herself. She's not battered. No such thing happened. I mean, it just, she's, whatever. I think actually in that case she was widowed, and Mrs. Anderson had helped her, so Mrs. Anderson operates herself something like a chief. She draws people to her, she redistributes little bits of resources, she employs people in various roles, she takes orphans in, and then she employs the orphans, so she's quite an important local figure. But her ability to concoct things that are supposed to sound good to us is just amazing. So then she's telling me, she has a women's cooperative, and she really wants to get her women's cooperative funded, and can I help her? And I say, well, I don't know, one of my students is studying the Global Fund for Women, and they do like really authentic local projects. That's what they're always looking for, so it's not a huge NGO. It's actually, maybe I could help you. I said, do you have anything? She said, oh yes, she said, I have some documentation. She goes running off to her house, brings back this folder, I open it, and there is her letter. It turns out she got a couple of grants from Danida, which is the Danish aid agency, via her husband or his contacts or something. That is, she had some link to the Danes. And there's the letter right on top saying from Danita, dear Mrs. Anderson, we gave you, $40,000 and then another $80,000 and no project ever occurred. And how could you take the money and never do anything? And certainly we won't be giving you any money again. I mean, I can't remember the exact, I think I took a picture of the letter, but the point is, there's the letter actually saying you stole all our money and you never built anything, and we're outraged. And then she shows me, actually, takes me over to see her house. And that's what she did with the money. She built this extremely nice house that is, way fancier than anything you would see by Malawian standards. And she has quite good taste, and it's furnished kind of in Western style because she had this Danish husband. She has, again, she died actually last year, but she's quite an impressive person. And in many, many ways, resourceful. And in fact, of course, she did take care of orphans because that's how she recruited her employees. And many of those children have been with her since they were young. And then I realized, wait, everybody I meet, basically, this was very true in Botswana, you would meet someone and then she would introduce you to her nephew, and then you hear that she's taken in her nephew, he's come to live with her so he can go to school or whatever. And then when it's time for tea, rooibos in that case, Michael, I need my tea. Oh, I must have my tea now. Michael. And then also Michael is helping her build a new house, and he's dealing with the contractors while she goes off to her day job. I mean, so these ties of economic and personal interdependence are pervasive, and they do not draw the distinction we draw. I can't describe all the things that made this clear to me, between really loving somebody, which should be free of any material concern, and being materially dependent, which is suspect. No, for them, you really do love people who help you materially. And when you try to understand why people help others, which they do even at great cost to themselves, the answer is often, if you ask them, I couldn't say no to her because I love her. So the answers really have to do with, there's a wonderful new book called Having People Having Heart. And people who have heart can't say no because they have heart. So you come to really experience what this is like, and how Mrs. Anderson is functioning as a patron, and how central that is to her business. Okay, I'm going to be very brief about Chief Zulu, because his reign was brief. But just to say that when we were there, the manager of the motel, not Mrs. Anderson, but the guy who worked for her, came over and said, we have to go see the chief. And then we realized, no, we said, fine, whenever you want, you take us, fine. No, he said. No, you have to bathe and put on very clean clothing. And do you have a gift? What gift will you bring for him? And so great deal of anxiety. He himself carefully bathed, put on cleanly ironed and pressed clothing. We did the best we can, not being people who bring the kind of clothing you can iron to Malawi. It would have been better if we had something that could have been ironed, but we didn't. And I took a mag flashlight that I happened to have and gave that as a gift. Susan took a carton of cigarettes. The guy was ecstatic. So Susan smokes all the time. One of the worst things about collaborating with her. And so that's why you see Chief Zulu here. There's Chief Zulu.
Cigarette.
And he is smoking one of the cigarettes that Susan gave him. And he is looking so pleased with himself. And in fact, he came back to visit us at the motel so that we could buy beer for him and all his friends. So he brought several dependents with him. This is, if you read about like the 16th century processions of Elizabeth I, she brought all her retinue with her when she went around her domains, and they had to be fed and cared for. Well, this guy had his little retinue of 5 or 6 people, and they had to be entertained by us at our expense, so we did. Well, all right, now I'm going to go back and show you something really important. Okay, got to go back. Here. This guy, who happened to be married to this woman that had once worked for Susan, I won't tell you his name for some kind of strange IRB-ish type reasons, even though this isn't published and it isn't really research. But during this actual event, which was probably 2008, I was chatting with him and I said, we did interview him at some point, and one of the questions I always ask is, are you from a chiefly family? Are you from... Yes, he said, his father is a chief. I say, from where? He says, from TA Zulu, which is where we were. He said, we stayed at the Kaisa in Machinji. He said, he knows. I said, what happened to TA Zulu, by the way? It must have been later than, last time we were there, I didn't see him. He says to me, he was deposed. And I said, what? He was deposed? Yes, turns out he became chief very young. We knew this. He was 21 when he became chief because his father had died at 44 of AIDS. So a very young death. He becomes chief very young. He immediately has to marry. Apparently he became alcoholic. So this request for beer from us was part of a general pattern. He drank way too much. As he became more alcoholic, he finally was deposed. And so I said to this guy, he was deposed. How was he deposed? Does the government come? There's a government stipend, and a house actually comes with being a TA. And I said, did the government? Oh, no, he said, the royal family made the decision. So the royal family made the decision. And I said, wow, how does that happen? And this was one of the most amazing things. He said, well, it's very hard to describe. He said, you know about the Sanhedrin? I just couldn't believe it. This is from the Torah, basically. The Sanhedrin is the group of priests who decide things. I said, trust me, there isn't one American in 10,000 who knows what you're talking about. And he laughed and he said, well, he had actually gone to seminary, so he knew about it. There are just wonderful things that happen. So Chief Zulu was deposed, and when I came back in, I think, 2013 to Kaisa, I met the new Chief Zulu. So it turns out that TA Zulu, it's not a personal name. The TA, Traditional Authority Zulu, is by definition, no matter what his name was before, the TA Zulu is the TA, the Traditional Authority of the administrative district called TA Zulu. So TA Zulu is the TA of TA Zulu is true by definition, right? It is always going to be true. And the new TA Zulu was a woman. And there was actually Mrs. Anderson, had some Danish theater group had come who did a culturally inappropriate performance. You would not believe. Malawians, women do not show their legs and their bottoms. So breasts, no problem. But extreme, now it's changing now. Urban women wear pants, but basically covering your lower extremities is extremely important. And these Danes did all these things where there was a sort of send-up of clowning, and they did, their vaginas and their asses and their assholes, and it was I mean, they couldn't have been worse, but anyway, we all survived. But this performance was put on behalf of, for T.A. Zulu, who was sitting there with her counselors and her headmen, and she was on a kind of raised dais, and there were hundreds of people doing beautiful, complex, fertility dances, and it went on all day. So they put on a major shindig for this visiting troupe and for, okay. Then I'm also, here's where both, in both of the places we stayed in 2006, we start to get a real picture of how the global actors are interacting with the locals. And two small things from the Caesa, so this is still Mrs. Anderson's outfit. They had a bar and a restaurant, and so people would just be there. They would be driving from point A to point B. The bar was right next to the Zambian border, so a lot of people from Zambia came over. And I'll just give you a couple of examples here. One is that the guy who was one of only 2 monitoring and evaluation specialists for EU micro projects happened to drop by. It turned out in another place we met the only other EU micro projects M&E person, and we have followed both those people over 10 years. We know all about them and how they've done. This guy has become enormously successful, but I'm going to give you the photographs he transferred on his stick to us, these nice pictures. So here was the little stream EU micro projects was asked to build a bridge over. That was the makeshift bridge before. Here's the bridge that EU micro projects actually built, and this is the dignitaries coming out to, bless the bridge or confirm the bridge or something like that, and he had photographs of this. And then here is a celebration of here's a guy dressed in a mask and so forth to celebrate the bridge. And here is, there's a men's secret society that's a Chewa traditional ritual, and normally in the historic thing it would have operated a little bit like a vigilante group, and it certainly wouldn't have been for public occasions like this, but they very nicely adapted their style. Okay, so that was one thing, and we came to understand a little bit about how the EU micro projects outfit operated. But the really fascinating thing, and the similar things happened, but I'm going to talk about this particular guy who I'm going to call Moses. And he was one of the data entry clerks. He had managed to get a job there. He turns out extremely brilliant mathematically, but anyway, he'd gotten a job as a data entry clerk. He's a very disciplined, very disciplined, hardworking guy. And this data entry job, since the interviewers are going out during the day doing all these interviews, the data entry people really have to stay until the data gets entered at night, and there's a lot of checking of the data, and everybody's going over these questionnaires again and again to try to make sure. There's a lot of demographic data, and you can't let errors creep in and what. And it's very complicated, I'll just say. It's all very high end. And he comes at some point, and I have no connection to him. I have no, there was something like, 15 data entry clerks, and then another 40 interviewers, and 10 or so supervisors, like that. And I have no particular connection to him. And he comes and asks if I will help him with school fees. And I say, no, I can't. I got these women I'm committed to, and I really can't. And he says, well, then he tells me his story. I still don't help him, mind you, but this is his story. First of all, he had done extremely well on the school leaving exam, it's a British type system. So they take something at the end of high school. They take examinations throughout school, but the critical one is something called the MSCE. I've forgotten what the letters exactly stand for, but anyway, it's the big exam. And only people who score very high on that, and then on another examination that is specially for the elite college there, called Chancellor College, get into Chancellor. And if you get into Chancellor, at least up until very recently, you got a full scholarship in your housing. So this was the only route. And so you take these examinations, you go back for the next round of examinations, your family has made tremendous sacrifices to pay your school fees all the way through secondary school, which is, some primary school is free, but secondary school costs money. and there's always uniforms and books and so on and so forth. And then they publish a list in the paper of everyone who's gotten into Chancellor. And he had done so well on the exams that he was definitely going to Chancellor. He knew what his score was. And then when they published the list in the newspaper, his name was not there. And there's no appeal. There's no second guessing. There's nobody you can go to. Your name isn't on that list. And in fact, later, I met another guy, whom I'm going to call Arthur when we get to him. But he had changed his name. He's from the north. His last name started with a Z. And he changed his last name to a last name that starts with C, because not in his year, but a few years earlier, when they admitted students to Chancellor, they ran out of slots before they got to the end of the alphabet. And so the list of people who got in just ended partway through the S's. And he did not want it. So these people live, you start to realize, my goodness, they live in a really arbitrary, unpredictable world within which they have very little control, and where there is lots of what Susan and I have come to call malice. So we have a chapter in our book called Merit, Miracles, and Malice. And malice is sometimes intentional. That is, the presumption is that some politician or some powerful person on the board that does the examinations swapped out this guy's name for the name of someone, the child of a friend, his own child, somebody who bribed him, you don't know what. And you never will know. And we have many, many other stories. Then the second thing that happened to this guy is that after that, he lives on something called Likoma Island, which is in the middle of Lake Malawi, and living there is a big disadvantage because you're cut off from the cities. You can only get to and from that island by ferry. By the way, for those of you who are demographers, this is where Stefan Hellinger did this amazing study of sexual networks in Malawi. The island's huge, and anyway, he basically did a complete survey of all the sexual ties among people on that island. All right. This same guy, Moses, decided he would try to go for pilot training to become a pilot of a ferry on Lake Malawi. So not an airplane pilot, but a ferry pilot. And of course, he's so bright, he gets accepted right away. He gets the books. He's extremely excited. He still talked about it. He said, we learned trigonometry because, of course, that's what trigonometry is for, to be able to navigate by the stars. That's why trigonometry was invented. And the physics, and they learned all this stuff, and he's so intellectually alive. He was just thrilled. After 6 weeks, the program was canceled with no explanation. It was just over. And he was never going to be a pilot. And his books, he could keep the books, but they weren't useful for anything except reading, and no chance. So he was trying yet again via me to get somebody who would help him with school fees so he could maybe go to university, to a private university. All right, now I'm going to skip ahead. I don't have a slide for this place, but in 2011, Susan and I stayed in this absolutely tiny place in the far north, because there's something up there called the Kuranga Prevention Monitoring Center or something. And it's run by Dutch people, and they monitor TB. That's what they do. And it's right up near the Tanzanian border. It's really in the far, far, far north of the country. And she knew that some group she knew were going to be staying up there. There was no survey that year. And so we managed to get ourselves up there, stayed in this tiny nowhere. We are nowhere, in the middle of nowhere, I'm telling you, in this place called Chilumba. There were 3 little, motel-like units that some guy had built. We took all 3 because we had a student with us. And there was no one to take care of us. So there was a house across the road, and the woman who was staying in that house would let us use her kitchen or cook in her kitchen. And the Kuranga people, there was some little survey group staying there, and we had our dinners with them. So that was how that worked out. We are sitting there one day. Oh, I should say, the Kuranga people asked Susan to give a little talk about AIDS demography, or I don't know what. And so a little poster goes up there at 7 a.m. the next day. She is going to give her talk. 3 o'clock that afternoon, who appears on our doorstep but Moses? And of course, from our point of view, he's like, reemerged. I mean, when we last saw him, he was in a totally different part of the country. He's from a totally different part of the country. And what is he doing there? Okay, well, it turns out he was stuck on Tacoma Island. He saw that he was going nowhere and was desperate to do something. So his mother had a brother who worked in the far north of the country for the electric company or something. So he did not know that uncle, but he went to live with that uncle so that he could get out of where he knew he had no hope. And he was kind of thrashing around. One day he's walking on the road there, eating one meal a day, by the way, so that he won't use up the uncle's resources, walking on the road, and he meets someone he had gone to school with. And that person says, I am working at this Karanga Prevention Tracking or whatever it's called center, and they actually are trying to hire data clerks. And this is just from his point of view, and he's very, very religious, as is almost everyone in Malawi. This is a miracle. And here's his friend out of nowhere who is from a totally different place. He says, I've forgotten what he told us exactly. 40 people took the exam for the position, and then 15 were interviewed, and 2 were hired, and God was with him, and so he was hired. So he's been working there, and he comes into work, and of course, lo and behold, here is this completely preposterous thing, which is that Susan Watkins, of all people, is giving a talk the next morning. So, of course, he immediately finds out where we are, comes to see us, and by that point, and this is, again, we met him in 2006. He had already had many years of disappointments before that. By this time, it's 2011. He still has not managed to go to university. He's still desperately striving to do so. He's been saving all the money he makes. He's been admitted. He's a Seventh-day Adventist, I should say. So his discipline is to be a vegetarian in a place like Malawi. Very, very difficult, I'll just say. He's gotten admitted to the Adventist University. So, amazing. But he says he has to take one more examination there, so he has to take a bus ride all the way. It's like 12 hours to get to the place where the university is, and his computer screen has gone blank. He doesn't have a computer to take. Well, it just happened that literally the day before I had left for Malawi, a student who had worked on the project the year before had come to my office, and she'd said, I took this Acer home with me because I was still doing a little bit of work for the project, and I don't need it, and do you want it? And I said, sure, I'll take it to Malawi with me. I'm sure somebody there will have use for it. So I said, you know what, Moses? In my room right now, I actually happen to have a computer, and let's see if it works, and if it does, you can have it. Well, you think that guy doesn't believe in miracles? Certainly he does. Certainly he does. And for very good reason, which is that's the only way good things actually do happen. And they do happen, not just when you run in, they happen for all sorts of weird reasons. Okay, I'm not going to have nearly enough time to talk about the 40 things I want to talk about, but I'm going to talk about a couple of other miracles, just to give you a sense of the way this world works, and it'll allow me to make a couple of the other big points I had written down. So let me see if I can run through the rest of my slides just for fun here. Oh, this is the people at the Kaizen wishing us goodbye, throwing flowers on the thing. These rituals are common and important. Okay. So I left out the whole part now. So in 2006, we also stayed at this Mpaweni Motel. And I'm going to show you, there's the Mpaweni Motel, the outside, and guys who work there just hang around the gate. There is one of our very brilliant, amazing research assistants working away. We had a little shelter there where we worked. That's my rear end, and Susan looking up at me as we're doing something. This is a guy who works there. These are what the beautiful little shallots look like where Susan and I stayed. They are totally unimaginably grody inside. You wouldn't believe it. The contrast between inside and outside is unreal. This is the slaughtering tree that was right next to the motel, where it's a largely Muslim area, and they hang the goats upside down, so the other goats are standing around watching this, and then they hang them upside down by their feet. They slit their throats, and then very quickly, since there's no refrigeration, people come and buy the offal and the this and the that and the parts and drive off with them or walk off. And this is a little youth center that was defunct at the time I saw it, but it's part of the same story. This is, by the way, a stop campaign to get Malawians to stop all their sexual practices, actually. So there were like 8 slogans, one of which was stop harmful cultural practices, stop sexual exploitation, stop child marriage, stop this, stop that. Unbelievable. So the whole country. All right, now I'm going to go back. I really don't have time. And just say, while we were there, we saw this enormous number of trainings. And this is a huge motel. Everybody in Malawi knows it because it was so cheap. It had sort of dormitory-like rooms in the middle, and then these chalets and half chalets. Anyway, probably you could have 200 people stay there, and it had a big room where you could either throw dances or you could have big meetings. And so religious groups went there, high school graduates went there to celebrate their graduations, and many, many, many NGOs held trainings there. And so we started trying to figure out what the heck all this training was. And we would call people over after they came out of these trainings and say, well, like, what did you learn there? And somebody would say, we would buy them a soda, typically that's a Fanta, just a treat. People don't usually, they get money for going to the trainings, but they save it and take it home to their families. So they don't get a treat. They do during the day. They get a Fanta and a bun in the morning, Fanta and a bun in the afternoon. But to get an extra Fanta, big treat. So we did that. Talked then, what did you learn? And they'd be very enthusiastic. Oh, it was great. Learned about decision making. So Susan, who's very, very cynical, says, how old are you? She says, this guy, and he says, 26. And she says, so you learned about decision making. Did you not make decisions before? He said, oh no, I made decisions, but I didn't know it was called decision making. And it has 4 steps and so on and so forth. So we began to get some insight into the enormous interest, and also we began to start looking carefully at what AIDS projects do. And it turns out all they do is training. If you look at an environmental project, climate change project, an AIDS project, and you actually read the fine print, you will find out that what it provides is training. Now, that's not true for the ones that provide drugs. There are some, but training is the thing that makes the project sustainable. So Susan said my best paper so far is called Teach a Man to Fish, and the social consequences of the sustainability doctrine, which is if you want your project to be sustainable as donors define it, you can't pay anybody on the ground. You can have a big staff in the capital of educated people who get sustained by the money the donor provides, but the villagers are supposed to volunteer because otherwise the project wouldn't be sustainable. And so all it can provide is training, for which they get these tiny per diem type allowances, and then that's all they get. And the whole NGO economy revolves around this thing. Okay, then I'm going to go back to miracles and then I'll be done, because I could go on. I literally have, I got 4 times what I have allowed the time to talk about. I want to go back to merit, miracles, and malice. So this wonderful woman whom I'm so fond of, who I'm calling Chifundo here, and there she is. She got a little plumper, and her boy got a little bigger, and then she got much thinner. She managed to extricate herself from this motel and start a wedding cake business that eventually morphed into a wedding creating business. So here's one of the weddings she decorated, and she now owns, she's built up bit by bit, and she now owns this dais thing that she can have the weddings on, and she's got a whole way of doing it where the people who are having the wedding buy all the fabric beforehand with her. They go to the store together, they pay for the fabric. So even if they try to cheat her at the end, all she loses is her labor. She hasn't lost any money up front. And if it works well, as it normally does, she's very respected in the community and has a lot of clout, she ends up with the fabric as well. So she does very well. Yeah. All right. I didn't get to talk about this. There's another whole situation that's amazing, but I won't go there. Her assistant manager is another one of these people working for a miracle. So she had not done well enough on the school leaving examinations to go to university. She saved her pittance from this assistant manager job. She, course by course, built up the basic. You need 12 courses to get an accounting degree, and you have to go to school for 1 year. So she went to school for 1 year at a business college. She got a tutor locally whom she paid in this small, nowhere place they live to tutor her. She passed one exam, another exam. Finally, at the end of 6 or 8 years of trying, she has this junior accounting certificate. So it's really the equivalent of 2 years of college. And she starts applying for jobs in the city. And she's sending her resume, and of course, she doesn't know anybody. She's from a rural area. She isn't going to get a job in the city. But she's applying. Nothing happens for a year and a half. She stops. It's over. She can't get out of there. And then, one day, a letter comes to the motel addressed to her. And my friend, the Chifundo, opens it. And the letter says, this very, very good NGO, which is, it does vocational, it's called SOS Children's Villages. You might have heard of it. It's a kind of high-end, a real NGO based in, I think in Britain or somewhere anyway. It has funding and does real things. It does vocational training. Wants to interview her. When? Tomorrow. Because there's no reliable postal service. This letter has probably been wandering around Malawi for 2 weeks. In fact, the fact that it got to her at all is itself miraculous. Just the idea that mail would actually be delivered. People don't usually have home addresses. People who live in villages don't have addresses at all. So it would be delivered to the local World Vision office or someplace, but the motel, of course, has an address that was delivered. And what had happened was that a man who used to stay at the motel knew her and knew that she is totally, totally honest. She really is. She is, unlike many, many, many Malawians, she is totally, but both these women are just amazingly honest. And she's a very, very strong Assemblies of God Christian, but really even compared to other very religious born-again Christians, she is super honest. And he took a copy of her resume and submitted it on her behalf to this organization. Maybe he also knew someone, although that part of the story was never told to me. And that's why she got this letter. And her boss, my friend, arranged to have the motel send her at its expense to the capital to try to collect various debts from various government ministries that had never paid them for trainings that were held at her motel. And she knew she never would be paid. But the boss could be told that the money was well spent in this effort, and Mercy went and she got the job, and her income went from 20,000 kwacha a month, which is, even at that time, it was probably about $20 a month, to 150,000 kwacha a month. And she spent all the money trying to get the next school certificate. So more next time. All right, that's as much as I have time for. Thank you. It was the last motel we stayed in, just so that you can. So questions? Yeah. And wait, I'm going to show you. Yeah, so you don't feel too sorry for me. This is the place we stayed last summer, right on the shore of Lake Malawi. Utterly gorgeous. 19 days of work. That's the shallots. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Questions? Yes.
So I'm really interested in. I'm really interested in this idea of interdependence and love, and kind of that all of these things can commingle and are entrenched with one another. And I guess I'm wondering, do you think that this interdependence has facilitated some of these miracles? So in the story that you have, even with your interaction with the computer and then the other situation,
this guy getting her the job.
the guy getting her the job, but over time, people have to hustle, they have to be very resilient, but it's not just a mercenary thing to me, it doesn't seem. It's also this love,
Yeah.
is an interesting aspect.
Yeah,
So if you could
well,
talk about
I will again recommend an anthropologist named China Schertz has written, SCHERZ, has written this book called Having People, Having Heart. It's very short. It's about 2 NGO projects in Uganda, one of which, they're both Catholic run, and they both take care of orphans, so they're quite similar, but one is run by a little order of nuns who think they're doing charity, and the other is run by an NGO that thinks it's doing sustainable thing. The one that does the sustainable stuff is actually wealthier. It has more resources. It can actually do more for kids. These nuns are apparently completely incompetent to read her book, and they can't basically do anything. But they are beloved by the community and understood as trying to help, because ties of dependence are considered normal. Whereas the NGO wants to make people independent. And that's anathema. That's breaking social bonds. Why would you do that? And so the idea of independence that has this enormous mystique for us, we want to empower people. And what we really mean by that, we want to empower women, and we want to empower villagers, and we want to empower everybody and make them not dependent on the people they're dependent on. But in fact, what validates you as a human being there is, in some sense, both being dependent and having people depend on you. So she really has a wonderful description of this. And I guess what I would say is that, and I intend to say this even more in print, is, look, if they had their druthers, I think they would be nostalgic for an old world. But if they had a fully functioning labor market, a modern labor market, and a rule of law state, so that you could have private property that was protected, your claims and your children and your goat and your land and so forth were protected, and you could get a job based on your talents and abilities and your education, they would trade what they have now for that world in a flash. But they don't have that. And so they are totally dependent on a whole set of informal relationships with other people, which both make bad things that happen, not only due to malice of particular people, and we have so many stories of this. It's not just getting your name left off the list. It's having the woman who runs the 5-woman NGO that you work for one of our more educated friends, told by the board who runs the NGO, do not use our funds to buy yourself a car. Buys herself a car, the NGO is shut down, and everyone but her loses their jobs, and she moves on. I mean, or people cheating other people, or lying about them, or just huge numbers, but also witchcraft, which is an incredibly powerful, real aspect of every moment of everyday life. And all I can say is, in a world where you are dependent on other people's unpredictable kindnesses and unpredictable malice, the idea that there is floating malice out there in the world that you can't control, that's due to witchcraft, is, it makes total sense. And I would say basically every African I know at every level, even the very well-educated Africans, are loath to really reject the idea of witchcraft. My friend, this Mercy, who got the amazing job at that good NGO, we were sitting around with her at breakfast on the last day before we were leaving one year, and one of our anthropologist friends, he's a guy and he's very outspoken and obnoxious. Anyway, we got the morning newspapers. There are two newspapers in English. They're the only 2 newspapers. And one has a little Chichewa section, but basically they're 2 newspapers. And we always get both of them, and we were sitting around reading them, and both had the same front page story. And that story was about a woman who gave birth to a stone. And there's a photograph of the stone on the front page, and sort of looking, wrapped in a little bit of moist-looking black cloth, looking really nasty. And then the story was the woman had been bewitched by her in-laws, and she had given birth to a stone, and this had actually happened before. And no, the in-laws said they didn't do it, that's completely ridiculous. Her parents had done it, so her kin had bewitched her. And so our friend started just ranting about this, and he was saying it's so sad this woman was having these false pregnancies. It's clearly a psychological issue. This country is just so stupid. These people believe this stupid thing about witchcraft. Terrible, terrible. My friend is sitting right there. So after I just said, Mercy, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry he talked that way, and I'm sorry he said those things, and I don't know if it hurt your feelings. She said, no. She said, it didn't bother me. And I said, you don't believe in witchcraft? She said, no, I don't. And fine, she doesn't believe in witchcraft. And then I thought for a second, I said, wait a minute, do you mean you don't believe in witchcraft like that woman wasn't bewitched and she didn't give birth to a stone? Or do you mean that you don't believe in it because it can't hurt you? And she said, oh, no, of course. Oh, she gave birth to a stone. Oh, no, she was bewitched. Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, I have Jesus. And Jesus is stronger than any witchcraft. And our pastor says, we can't believe in witchcraft. And what she meant is if you believe in it, then you really do get sick. And you really do die. And you really can't let it happen to you. And she has Jesus. I've heard this now again and again. Another guy who turned in a colleague at an NGO who had stolen a lot of money. And I said, are you afraid of that guy bewitching you? And he said, no, I have the one up there. He'll take care of me. So, I don't know, that's more than you asked, but.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the presentation. Just to sort of like build on that, right? I think that there's this really sort of like unique idea of sort of interdependence, right? Particularly when it comes to African philosophy, right? And sort of being like holistic and non-linear, right? I think there's this very important notion of going against the individual, right? So if you can speak a little bit to how this sort of idea, right, goes against Western sort of notions of the self, and also goes against sort of like settler colonial or colonial notions of the self.
I couldn't agree with you more, so that's the first thing I'll say. And there's big literature now in anthropology about which I'm very ambivalent, but they've developed this really gross term, the individual rather than the individual. So the idea is individual is somehow more fused with other people and all that. I would say two things. One is I don't know what Africa was like before the colonial period. I really don't. But people were not just, fused together members of a group. They were constantly, first of all, one village was at war with another village. And they were trying to figure out how to advantage themselves. The Africans I know are among the most effectively assertive, energetic people who are always, even the very, very poor villagers, and the poster for this thing is me standing with, they are constantly scheming, I would say, to figure out how to help themselves and help their families. And that is, but yes, for them to be a person who counts, and it has a little bit to do with status and inequality, to be a person who matters, is to be a person who's taking care of other people. And this is related to the way the chieftaincy system and the clan system worked, which is, it wasn't this egalitarian, communal, everybody's the same and everybody loves everybody. It was that the more people, so this is the African anthropology term, wealthy people, that one way to think, this is a little bit of pseudo-mythical history. But if you think about a place where nothing material lasts very long, so just the weather and so forth, if you have cattle, they die of the rinderpest. If you have groundnuts or something and you collect them, they get moldy or rot. It's definitely true for maize, that everybody's maize gets moldy and sometimes poisons them, and it's actually extremely hard to keep anything, and certainly nothing lasts from year to year. So the form of accumulation, if you will, is to give away what you have and acquire indebtedness from others. So that's the most materialist way to think about it, that if you are an important man in a bride wealth marriage system, now not all the systems are like that, you have a lot of cattle, and your sons and your other nephews and so forth can't get married without cattle. So you give this one 6 cattle and that one, and they come and ask you, and you do it even if you're not sure where you yourself will get more cattle, and pretty soon everybody owes you something. And that, so it's partly, you can think of it in a very kind of calculating way like that. But the other way you think about it is that African chieftaincy is based on a situation in which there has always been tons of land and very few people. The African continent was never heavily populated. And so rulership did not involve having some piece of territory and defending it. It involved attracting people to you, having a sacred center, like the Great Zimbabwe, say, and then the chiefs, sort of resources flow upward, and then fertility and actual material resources are redistributed downward. So that the chief provides the fertility of the land, his generosity enacts that fertility. And so in a way, yes, I think people can't understand, these are ties of interdependence. There are also exchanges of favors among friends, because another way, a lot of things just don't work very well. Like the mail doesn't work. Well, that means if you want a letter to get from point A to point B, you've got to have a friend who takes it for you. And that's true in Eastern Europe before, but yes, I think there are distinctive African patterns that have to do with that generosity and with the extraordinary meaning attached to taking care of other people. And it's just, you can't be a person, you can't be Ubuntu, you can't be a human being without taking care of other people. Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you can say anything about what happens if you don't follow these norms, and
well, one thing, if you...
And you don't, and somebody's collected all these debts,
Yeah.
but nobody helps him.
Yeah.
Or
So there are definitely free rider problems, or whatever you would call them, and two things. One is witchcraft is an incredibly important sanction, and it works in two ways. So witchcraft is really interesting because you never can prove whether or not something was witchcraft, ever. You can't. And you never actually know for sure. So you know that your child died, or you know that you got horrendously sick, but you don't actually know for sure who bewitched you. And so witchcraft works in two different ways. One is you yourself can actually be bewitched, and people are very, very afraid of that. And when they have screwed other people, I'll use the French for this, they are truly worried. So I'll give you an example. When this guy Malusi became president, Malusi was the president of Malawi, and he arranged that his successor, a guy named Bingu wa Mutharika, be elected. And Bingu turned on him and created his own political party and basically defected and turned on his mentor. And then he would not go live in the presidential house. And all this speculation in the newspaper, why won't the guy go live in the presidential house? And then he makes an announcement saying it's not because he thinks the house is bewitched. That's not why he's not living there. He's not living there because whatever, doesn't have enough rooms, or he has some excuse. But it's very, very clear. And exactly, Dan Smith, the anthropologist, has written about an identical thing in Nigeria, where one big political president of the country betrays his successor turns on him and betrays him. And again, there's this huge problem about the witchcraft. So that's one answer. Or you yourself can be accused of witchcraft. So how did you get so rich? You must have drunk the blood of other people's children when you killed them. Well, that's witches eat corpses. So that's no funerals are ever held. People don't eat meat after a death. They just don't eat it at all until after the funeral event has occurred, where meat will be served, because it could create the implication that you yourself are a witch because you're seen eating meat. And the chief has to certify why the death occurred, or there won't be a burial. You can't have a burial. So I would say that's one sanction, but also people get away with a lot of stuff. I was going to use another example here. So my wonderful friend Chifundo, I had given her a used computer. So I've been using the university surplus. You can buy used ThinkPads for about $40, and they work. They're wonderful. So I had taken one to her, and that guy had asked me the next year, he emailed me and asked me, a friend of hers, whom we both know well. I've forgotten what name I made up for him, but anyway, yes, I'm calling him Precious, which is a common male name. So Precious had asked me to bring him a computer. So I met him in the yard of her motel. She was still working motel. We weren't staying there, but anyway, I came over with the computer. He immediately asked me for it. He rushed off, went and made sure it worked, came back, and then she told me while he was off fiddling with the computer that he had come 9 months earlier and borrowed her computer and refused to return it. He said, oh, well, it's broken and I have to get it fixed first. And finally she got so desperate she went to his house. She was using it to do all the accounts for the motel, so it was really critical to her work. And he never gave it back. Now, I think he sold it. That's my hunch, that he had acquired a new partner and he wanted to not lose the partner for not being able to support her. That's my hunch. But why he would endanger his relationship with me, I'll never talk to that guy again, let alone help him with anything. And why he would endanger his relationship to this woman. I don't know. So the answer is I don't have a good answer about why people do get betrayed by people. Yeah, Richard.
You mentioned you work with several different language groups in the country. Different languages?
Yeah, there are many languages.
And I'm wondering if these networks cross the language boundaries.
So again, what I would say is, first of all, the languages have a little more fluid boundaries than you would think. So many people speak two or can communicate in several, even if they don't. So if you meet many Africans, in fact, sometimes they speak 5 or 6 languages because these are all Bantu languages, and they must have some similarities. And then I think the answer is mostly not, because the real relationships of interdependence, the paradigmatic ones, are kin-based. But I would say for these people who know English, for example, who would need it at training, so the trainings normally wouldn't be in local languages, you would bring people from 5 or 6 villages to a motel and you train them. They get enormous benefits from even information exchange with people they don't already know. So any chance to make a tie with someone not in their own area or from their own community is just a huge advantage. And the churches do the same thing. They circulate. They send like the praise team from one church to a distant church, and then the praise team from that church comes to your church. So the answer is I don't know whether it actually crosses language barriers, but I would imagine that people would be eager to have connections anywhere they could. Yeah.
Fortunately, we have to cut off to respect the time, but I think Anne will be willing to stay a few minutes if people want to chat informally. So thank you so much.
And then for my other, just last point that I forgot to tie that, one of the things I came to realize is that the NGOs, when they work because they become part of the patron-client system, right? That is actually how they work. And so this sort of cultural